For years, one place in Russia was considered completely untouchable. A private estate on the Black Sea coast, built behind checkpoints, patrol boats, and a no-fly zone that stretched for miles. Then, on the morning of August 3rd, that sense of safety collapsed in a matter of seconds. A drone came down just 22 kilometers away. It did not hit the palace, it did not even come close to the walls. But what happened next, and what it revealed about the war creeping toward Russia's interior, changed the conversation happening quietly inside the Kremlin. Welcome back to the channel. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. And if you're watching from somewhere outside the usual crowd, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from today. Now, let's get into it. The palace that was never supposed to exist along the Black Sea coast, near a resort town called Gelendzhik in Russia's Krasnodar region, sits a compound most Russians were never meant to know about. It became public knowledge in 2021 when the late opposition figure Alexei Navalny and his anti-corruption foundation released an investigation into the property. According to that investigation, the complex spans more than 17,000 square meters. It includes a restaurant, a helicopter pad, an underground ice rink, a church, an amphitheater, a guest house connected by an 80-meter bridge, and a pool area described as having its own nightclub built beneath the water level. Spas, saunas, Turkish baths, and extensive food production facilities round out the property. Navalny's team put the construction cost at more than 100 billion rubles, roughly $1.35 billion. The investigation triggered anti-corruption protests across Russia, arriving just days after Navalny himself had been arrested. Russian authorities denied the property belonged to Putin personally, though the denial did little to dampen the estate's reputation. To most of the world, and to a large share of the Russian public, it simply became known as Putin's palace. For over 2 decades, that palace symbolized something bigger than luxury. It represented distance from ordinary Russian life, distance from accountability, and once the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, distance from the consequences of a war launched from thousands of kilometers away. According to the Navalny investigation, the surrounding area sits inside a restricted no-fly zone, patrolled and secured well beyond what an ordinary private residence would require. That protection was built on one assumption, that nothing Ukraine had could ever reach that far. The morning that assumption broke. On the morning of August 3rd, a drone fell from the sky over Arkhipo-Osipovka, a crowded beach town in the Gelendzhik municipality, roughly 22 to 25 kilometers from the palace complex, depending on which outlet you read. What happened in the seconds before it hit the beach is still disputed. Ukrainian telegram channels, including one called Supernova, released footage appearing to show the drone abruptly changing course before crashing into the crowd. Their explanation was that the drone had been disrupted, likely by Russian electronic warfare, or a mobile air defense unit, and diverted from its intended path, rather than deliberately steered at civilians. A Ukrainian journalist, citing local authorities and independent Russian outlets, offered a similar account. Russian air defenses protecting the palace area may have intercepted the drone and sent it diving toward the shoreline instead. Russian officials told a different story, framing the crash as a direct and intentional strike on civilians. What isn't disputed is the outcome. Early reports from Russian authorities, relayed through the Moscow Times, said 4 people were killed, including a child, with 10 more wounded. As the day went on, the toll climbed. Later, Russian accounts put the number of dead at 6 or 7, including children, with the wounded rising past 40. The competing figures reflect how chaotic and fast-moving the reporting was in the hours after the crash, but even the earliest, most conservative count made one thing clear. This was no longer a war confined to a distant front line. Ukraine has not claimed the beach as an intended target, and has repeatedly said its long-range strikes are aimed at military and energy infrastructure, not civilians. According to reporting from Kyiv Post, one Ukrainian source claimed the drone had actually been headed for a facility connected to Russian missile production, and came down roughly 300 meters short of it after apparently being intercepted. That target lines up with something else near Arkhipo-Osipovka, a recreation center reportedly tied to employees of NPO Mashinostroyenia, a major Russian missile and aerospace manufacturer, sitting in the same stretch of coastline as the palace itself. So the geography tells its own story. Whatever this drone was actually aimed at, it was operating in the same narrow strip of Black Sea coastline where Russia keeps both a defense industry facility and its head of state's most private retreat. 22 kilometers is nothing in modern drone warfare. It is close enough to erase whatever comfort came from distance alone. Why this didn't come out of nowhere. To understand why a single drone crash near a beach town sent this kind of shockwave through Russian commentary, you have to look at what Ukraine had already been building for months. On March 17th of last year, President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that a Ukrainian drone had successfully completed a test flight covering 3,000 kilometers. He thanked the engineers behind it and said Ukraine was building out a full lineup of long-range weapons to help guarantee the country's security. That capability didn't stay theoretical. In June of this year, Ukrainian forces struck an oil refinery in Russia's Tyumen region, more than 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Zelensky confirmed the strike directly, tying it to the same 3,000-kilometer drone program he'd announced the previous year. Russian officials claimed air defenses had repelled the attack with no resulting damage, but the strike itself was never in question. It was proof, delivered in the form of a burning refinery deep in Siberia, that Ukraine's reach now extended into regions that had spent the entire war assuming they were untouchable. Then, on July 24th, in an interview with American commentator Laura Loomer, Zelensky went further. He said Ukrainian drones were already flying at ranges past 3,000 kilometers, and that by the end of this year, that number would climb to 4,000. By next year, he said, Ukraine expects to field drones capable of covering 5,000 to 10,000 kilometers. Those aren't vague aspirations. They're numbers tied to specific years, describing a defense industry that has clearly moved past experimentation and into planned, scaled production. A range of 10,000 kilometers would put almost the entirety of Russian territory within theoretical reach, sparing only the most remote stretches of the Russian Far East. Military analysts caution that hitting those figures in practice depends on real advances in propulsion, navigation, and communication systems, and that a lab-tested range is not the same as a reliable operational strike capability. Still, the trajectory is unmistakable. Every few months, the map of what Ukraine can reach gets larger, and the map of what Russia can consider safe gets smaller. The drone that came down near Gelendzhik didn't need to hit the palace to make that point. It only needed to land close enough. What this means for a man who built his safety on distance. None of the available evidence suggests Putin's palace was the actual target on August 3rd. The likely target, according to Ukrainian sources, was a missile-linked facility, not a residence. That distinction matters, and it would be misleading to claim otherwise. But intention isn't really the point here. Capability is. For years, the working assumption inside Russia's political elite was straightforward. Ukraine simply didn't have the tools to threaten anything beyond the immediate war zone. That assumption is what allowed a billion-dollar private estate to exist less than a day's drive from an active war, guarded not by distance from the fighting, but by the far more fragile idea that the fighting could never reach that far to begin with. A drone landing 22 kilometers away doesn't prove that idea was always false. It proves the idea has an expiration date. Once a region is shown to be reachable, even by accident, even by a drone chasing a completely different target, it cannot fully return to being considered unreachable again. That shift in perception tends to matter more than any single strike. It's also worth being honest about the counter-argument here. A near miss is still a miss. The palace stands untouched. Russian air defenses, whatever role they played in this specific incident, are clearly active and searching in that exact corridor of coastline, and Ukraine, for its part, has not indicated any interest in a strike aimed at Putin personally, focusing its stated targeting priorities on military production, energy infrastructure, and logistics. None of that should be minimized, and none of it should be exaggerated into more than it is. What can be said with more confidence is this. The geography of safety inside Russia has been steadily shrinking since June of last year. Refinery strike by refinery strike, range milestone by range milestone. The events near Gelendzhik on August 3rd weren't an isolated shock. They were the latest data point in a pattern that's been building in plain sight for over a year. The bigger picture step back from the palace, from the beach, from the disputed casualty counts, and a simpler story comes into focus. This war began with an assumption that Russian territory, especially the parts far from Ukraine's border, would remain functionally untouched. That assumption held for the first 2 years. It has not held for the last one. Long-range drone strikes on Russian refineries, a demonstrated 3,000-kilometer range with a stated roadmap toward 10,000, and now an incident that landed a drone within sight of one of the most heavily guarded private properties in the country. Together, these describe a war that has stopped respecting the old boundary between front line and home front. For Putin, that shift carries a weight that goes beyond strategy. The palace at Gelendzhik was built, quite literally, as a place removed from consequence. On August 3rd, it became something closer to a warning that no amount of money, marble, or restricted airspace guarantees a border the enemy has to respect. Whether that warning changes anything about how the war is fought from here is genuinely uncertain, and anyone claiming otherwise is guessing. But one thing is harder to dispute. The quiet confidence that once surrounded that stretch of Black Sea coastline is gone, and it's not clear it's coming back. Thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this one as they develop, subscribe and turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments what you'd like us to cover next.